And up next, we have Steve Hickman, who's a clinical psychologist and executive director of the nonprofit Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. And along with myself and Chris Germer and Kristen Neff, he is co-developer of the MSC teacher training and teaches MSC around the world. Steve is also the founding director of the UC San Diego Center for Mindfulness. So I'm just gonna leave this slide up because Steve does not have a PowerPoint. It's not that we forgot. What? They took it off. Oh, they took it off. Okay.
So, thank you. I'm very low tech, no slides. So my intention here is to talk a little bit about men and self-compassion. I could quit now while I'm ahead. So, one question partially that KC raises, sort of why is this important? So for me, it was important because as I showed up to start to teach mindful self-compassion, I noticed a trend, and the trend is reflected here in this room as well, and someone made reference to it earlier, of the sort of poverty of Y chromosomes in the room. Typically about 10% or so of any particular MSC group has men in it. If we hit 15, it's like, a flood of men. And there's something about me, I have a bit of an obsessive-compulsive streak, and so I need things to be orderly, and I feel like, well, half the population is not represented here. Well, how do we get some balance? How do we get those other people in the room? And you could say that about on a lot of other dimensions, too. I just wanted to note that in terms of people of color or diversity in a variety of different ways is always looking, and this is really the underlying message of maybe some of what we're talking about. For sure, what I'm talking about is thinking about how do we invite people into this practice that need it the most and may have the least access to it or not getting access to it. So it was important for me to have some balance. That's just my own quirky nature. But why is this important? And so I want to actually point out how important this is to direct attention to something Casey made brief reference to, is that today there were 11 people who died in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And I'd like to just take a moment for all of us to direct some compassion in that direction towards those 11 people, to the friends and families, the community surrounding them, the first responders that perhaps responded to this, and to a man with a gun who knew no other way to respond to his difficult feelings. So, pretty important, I'd say. And so as I've been teaching mindful self-compassion and learning this practice and practicing it and engaging with other teachers and scratching our heads and wondering why there aren't more men in the room and starting to think about barriers, what was keeping men from this. And your round of applause earlier was because there's something valuable to be gained in that space. And so we actually started a bit of a working group. We had about 25 of our MSC teachers from around the world that met about once a month for several months to talk about this problem, to address this, to see what can we do? What are we doing wrong? What could we do right? How could we reduce the barriers? And we spent a lot of time talking amongst ourselves about, okay, so what got us in so we can figure out how to get other people in. And there was some point when I said, guys, we're kind of preaching to the choir here. We are the kind of guys who show up at the Mindful Self-Compassion course. We're actually interested in the ones who don't. And it's been an ongoing challenge to think about that. And I think that, again, applies to any particular population that you sense is not represented in this space, is to how to think outside of your own perspective, our own perspective, and to think about what can we do to reduce those barriers? How can we make the tent bigger. So we thought about it in a lot of different ways and talked about, well, is there something about the language we're using in the course? And I remember in the early days of MSC when Chris provided me a wonderful last-minute opportunity to teach my first MSC intensive. So the first time I'd ever taught an intensive, he gave me a whole week's notice to say, I can't go and teach with Kristen in Germany, can you go and take my place? I said, okay. And so I'd never taught an intensive, I'd never taught in a foreign country, I'd never taught with Kristen before. A little intimidating, I have to say. And I had a week, which was probably good. But I remember... I remember Kristen really kind of coaxing me to sort of warm up the conversation. I'd been teaching MBSR for a long time. I was a little bit more on the cooler side of things and feeling nudged to be warmer, and I learned a lot from that experience. But started to feel a little too warm to me, a little uncomfortable. And back then, we sometimes used some examples of self-talk that involved referring to yourself as sweetheart and darling, which were a little tricky for me to pull off. But what I've learned, and this is a topic that 10 minutes doesn't do it justice, but what I've learned is that in its essence, this practice is this practice is this practice. And once they're in the room, you're golden. It's really kind of looking at what are the barriers outside. So, and there are a lot of them, and a lot of them have to do with the way we as men are raised. The traditional male role model, this, you're not supposed to have feelings, and if you are, there's some kind of a problem, and please just keep them to yourself, and, fake it till you make it. So the problem with fake it till you make it, when it comes to emotions, is at some point, for some people, it becomes fake it until you break it. And then bad behavior arises, like shooting, like sexual harassment, like violence of all sorts of bad behavior. And the time is now, if not now, when, right, to be creative, to work together, perhaps to find what are the ways in. So we've explored and uncovered a couple of ways that this is all an experiment, but within the Mindful Self-Compassion program, we've realized some things. One was we, at one point, decided to do a Mindful Self-Compassion intensive, 5-day intensive residential. Chris and I cooked that up. Our colleague Daniel Ellenberg was going to join us. We were really excited about the idea. There was a kind of a shortcoming to it, which was that nobody signed up. So we didn't go, just by the way. We didn't just go there and sit. But there was something about that. It was intimidating. It was like 5 days away and what's going to happen there? And so we've lowered the bar a bit. Still have hopes of something like that once, but Daniel Ellenberg, who I mentioned, and David Spound, and I have created a program called Ultimate Courage, Self-Compassion Workshop for Men. That's a 2.5-day workshop that we've done non-residential and residential. We're offering another one in San Diego. I put flyers in the back, but that's not why I was here. But this was a sort of shallower dive into this experience. And we have a live online MSC program that we offer through the Center for MSC, and we've taught one round of LO MSC just for men, and we're about to teach another one that David will be co-leading after the first of the year. Also flyers back there. We're being creative, and I think the point that I really want to make most, and I want to give you 2 brief examples, is that in the end, what we've learned from those experiences, we've taught 3 of those workshops so far, is that the number one most important piece of those workshops, the thing that has made it relevant and powerful for the people, is safety. Here we are men, we're supposed to be responsible for safety, of our partners, of our families, of all this. We're not doing the greatest job in certain areas as public the news reflects, but safety is a particularly huge issue. And we really find, my experience has been that once we create safety in that space, where guys can be with just guys. Nothing against you ladies, but something different happens. And you just create the space for this practice to happen. It happens. It's really amazing. And we don't have to do any weird special male rituals. No, we're not beating on our chests or, racing around in the forest or anything like that. But something different happens. And so it's heartening to know that all we have to do is figure out what are the barriers and work with them. And I've only named a couple of them. They're challenging. They're embedded in our society and our culture and how we raise boys and men, and that's a whole big topic. But once we can get them in the door, magic can happen. So I just want to share a couple of stories just as examples. And we've spent a lot of time talking about programs and big picture things, and that's all very important. But for me, I got to get down in the mud, in the details, in the weeds, and to kind of like hear the stories. So at the last one of these programs we did in San Diego, one of the exercises from Mindful Self-Compassion is kind of a work with our inner critic, actually noticing that we have a relationship with this inner critic and actually looking in a little closer to see how this inner critic is actually trying to help us, and to just work from that different perspective in a way that allows us to see things in a different way, to see our own struggles and suffering. And one guy in our group, older guy, probably in his 60s, early 60s, some guy who clearly had struggled a lot in his life and suffered. And we did this exercise, and it really allows people to sort of take a different perspective on a self-critical voice. And he said, I've known for years, and I've been in therapy for years, I've known that inner critic was the voice of my father. And he was a bastard. He was angry and mad at me all the time. He yelled. He was evil. He was angry. He just was constantly on me. I never felt love from him, and I've hated him for years. Because he was so mean to me. And he was in tears, by the way, as he was telling this. And he said, so I knew that was his voice. And he said, when I could actually have a little distance from him and see him as that inner critic, I saw that he was scared to death about being a father. And he could, in that moment, that the fact that he could see that perspective, that he could shift that perspective on his father, changed everything. I get chills when I tell the story, just because you could see the visible change in him just by that shift in perspective of being able to hold that critic in a different way. We had another situation where, at another training, where we led some meditation. I don't actually remember what one, but somebody wanted to speak about his experience, and he said, I was doing the meditation, and I was trying to be kind to myself, but I just realized that I don't believe that I deserve love and respect. And so I went ahead, and he started to go on, and our colleague Daniel stopped him. He said, "Hold on a second." He said, "Hold on. Did you say that you didn't feel you deserve your own love and respect?" And he said, "Yeah." And he said, so he tried to change the subject again. And Daniel said, "Hold on." And he said, what about right now? Do you think that you might be able to say that in this moment that you deserve your love and respect? And he kind of dropped his head, and he was like, no. No. And he was really struggling. And there was this long pause. There was about 15 of us in the room. One of the guys across the way sort of caught his eye, and he said, "John, you're deserving of my love and respect." And then one by one, every single man in that room repeated that, including us. I get chills again. I'm just up here getting chills. These are the things that happen in that space of safety that allow transformation to happen. Nothing magical. There was nothing in there that we did that is terribly different than a formal MSC course, perhaps. People share things that need to be shared. So I think there's something about us as men that have never found a group that faced inward to be a safe place. We're okay with being a team if we're all together going, parallel with each other and focusing on something else. But I just like to watch when the men come into the room and they see the chairs in a circle. They're like, anxiety goes through the roof, right? Like, I have some sense that in general women are a little more comfortable with that. There's a little bit more of that camaraderie and comfort in the group that doesn't necessarily happen for men, because a lot of our shame arises in the context of relational pain of various sorts and humiliation and various other kinds of things. So it's all about safety, really. I mean, women are very interested in what is it we're doing in there? What's this, When we did a webinar just earlier this week, Daniel hosted a webinar for our MSC teachers on sort of how to engage men in MSC and some of our experiences from Ultimate Courage. And of course, the vast majority of people who signed up were female MSC teachers. Everybody wants to know the mystery of what's happening in there. And it's, on the one hand, it's pretty unremarkable. It's just getting them in the room there. So anyway, I think that's as much as I really wanted to say. I think there's no question that this is important. And as I said, this idea of we can look at who's in the room and we don't want to overlook them, but there are so many more people who aren't here in the room that we need to constantly be tending to finding out what are the barriers, what are the opportunities, how can we be creative in supporting, getting people to this practice who can benefit the most and maybe have the least opportunity to practice it. It's an ongoing job, and all of us are the ones to do it. So, thank you.